Okay, more music to come. Tonight's class is a PURIM class, and the sentence you see depicted on your screen right now, we're going to get to towards the end. It's a very dramatic sentence in chapter 6, sentence 1 in the book of Esther, which says, "Balayla hahu nodada shnat hamelech." In the middle of the night, the king's sleep was disturbed. And that's really the turning point of the Megillah and the Megillah reading. So what we're going to look at tonight is we're going to do, there's two parts to this class. Part one is going to be looking at the arc and structure, the narrative arc and structure of the book of Esther. And part two is going to be looking at some of the inner workings that take place inside the book. And I'm going to share the screen again if we can here and look at our sources for tonight, which have disappeared. Okay. Oh, gosh. Okay, great. Now you can see the sources that we're going to look at tonight. Can everybody just tell me, would someone tell me if you can see the sources okay? If they're clear enough, it's PURIM Intrigue 5782.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And feel free to ask questions or interrupt, or at least to respond when you're asked a question, if you can. That'd be greatly appreciated. So first of all, by introduction, there's a sentence in the book of Esther that says, Esther reported to the king in Mordecai's name. And maybe we'll just take literally 2 minutes to review, fast forward the entire book of Esther. The book of Esther takes place in the city of Shushan, in the capital of the Persian Empire, approximately 2,500 years ago. The dating is a little tricky and controversial. And it involves a king Achashverosh calling a party, inviting the Jewish people to come. The party has hints of celebrating the destruction of the temple that put the Jewish people into exile. Then the queen Vashti is killed, replaced by Queen Esther, the Jewish queen. Haman becomes minister of the realm and seeks to destroy the Jewish people. Esther intercedes on behalf of the Jewish people at the advice of Mordecai. And through a series of parties that she throws, 2 parties, the king decides to have Haman hanged. And ultimately the decree against the Jewish people is reversed, and that the Jewish people were able to defend themselves and defeat their enemies. And hence the Jewish people were saved and remained safely in exile for the 70 years that they were decreed to be in exile. And then a segment of the Jewish people returned back to the land of Israel and rebuilt the second temple. That last part is not in this Megillah reading. So at a certain point, there was a conspiracy to kill the king. And Esther, Mordecai, who's a courtier in the king's palace, reports it to Queen Esther. Esther reports it to the king in the name of Mordecai, and those people are executed. So the Talmud derives from this, and is our first source up here on top. Whoever repeats a statement in the name of his teacher brings redemption to the world, as it is stated, and Esther told the king in Mordecai's name. Because the fact that Esther, instead of taking credit for herself and telling the king there's a conspiracy which was uncovered and those people were executed, she said it in the name of Mordecai. And that's a pivotal point in the narrative of the Haggadah, because it leads to Mordecai being rewarded by the king and opens the floodgates for the Jewish people to have salvation. So I want to give credit here to 2 rabbis, Daniel Gladstein of Cedarhurst, New York, and the first arc of narrative and essence of Purim comes from a talk that he gave. And the second part, in terms of the inner workings of salvation, comes from a piece that was put together by Avi Cohn of Detroit, and it's based on that. So please God, by giving credit where credit is due, we can see redemption come to the world. And to me, it's always very humorous if somebody gives a class on Purim and has sources that they don't quote properly, sort of could be defeating the whole purpose. Now, let's look at a source here. And you could have a Megillat Esther with you, or you can look at what we have on the screen. Either way is fine. I'll charge Frank, if you have the Stone Chumash with you, you'll tell us the page numbers appropriately. But if you look in chapter 6, the book of Esther, Megillat Esther is 10 chapters long, relatively brief. If you look in chapter 6, sentence 4, it says, "Who is in the court?" the king asked. For Haman had just entered the outer court of the royal palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hung on the tree that he had prepared for him. Okay, so that's a very dramatic moment in the narrative. It takes place in the middle of the story. And where Haman gets so incensed, oh, Frank, what page are we on?
We're looking at, oh, okay, I'm sorry. I forgot Esther was in this.
It's in the very back, like 12.
Yeah. Okay, give me a moment or so.
Sure.
1252.
I'm sorry?
1252?
Okay.
1252.
Okay, so since Marilyn got it first, she gets an extra Hamantaschen. This takes place between the first party and the second party. Once in the middle of the narrative, Esther decides to risk her life and her standing as queen in order to save the Jewish people. She throws two parties a day apart. And at those parties, there were really three people present. There's Achashverosh, the king, there's Haman, the villain, and there's Esther herself, the queen. So after the first party, Haman feels so good about himself that he decides first thing in the morning, even before dawn, he's going to go to the king and he's going to have Mordecai hung, because his personal antipathy for Mordecai was so overwhelming to him. And even though he knew and anticipated that the entire Jewish people were going to be wiped out within a short period of time, he felt, I just can't wait to see Mordecai killed. And therefore he goes to the court in the middle of the night, a dangerous thing to do, to tell the king, I have a gallows ready and I want to hang Mordecai on it. So let's look at the narrative here. We'll read it in Hebrew and then in English. I read it to you in English already. So it's the middle of the night. The king was awakened in the middle of the night because he couldn't sleep. He had just looked up in the Chronicles and read about the fact that Mordecai, the Jew, had saved his life by uncovering a conspiracy. So Haman comes, so the king is up, and lo and behold, there's Haman standing in the courtyard. And the Megillah says, what was Haman's intention? Haman's intention was to have Mordecai hung on the tree that he had prepared for him. Reads nicely in English. You look at the Hebrew. Litlot et Mordecai al ha'etz asher heichin lo. To hang Mordecai on the tree that was prepared for him. Now, let me ask you a question. If you wanted to take a word out of that sentence, what word could you take out from the Hebrew?
You want to respond?
Or the English? What do you want to say?
Why don't you respond?
The word lo, the last word, two letters of the word lamed vav. And in English, you could say the king about having Mordecai hung on the tree he had prepared, period, because we know he had prepared a tree to hang Mordecai on it. So the words for him are extra. So in the Talmud that questions everything, they wonder, why is that extra word lo there for him?
Was for,
And we are taught very dramatically, right? Lo heichin, in very brief two words, the Talmud says, in the fact was that he prepared the tree to hang himself on it, and he was king, he was hung on the tree. Now, let's leave that for a second. That's in the middle of the Megillah. And now I want to go to the very end of the Megillah, chapter 10, which has only 3 sentences in it.
That's
And-
1261.
1261, good. It's the very end of the Megillah. We read chapter 10, sentences 1 and 2. King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the mainland and the islands. All his mighty and powerful acts and the full account of the greatness to which the king advanced Mordecai are recorded in the annals of the kings of Media and Persia. And then it goes on a final sentence, which says that Mordecai had become a very great and revered person in the realm. A question, why do we have sentences 1 and 2? Some people might think it's for validation. Others explain, Rav Abramsky explains, that the reason these two sentences, really, we don't need them. And if you think about this being the dramatic conclusion, crescendo of the entire Megillat Esther, it comes down with a thud. The final sentence, and Mordecai was revered and he was known throughout the realm. That's very exciting to think about. But why do we need this idea of that there were tribute and taxes imposed upon the people? And number 2, if you really want to know what goes on, look at the annals of the king of Media and Persia. So does the Torah prefer us not to rely upon the book of Esther to know what happened? So the answers are this. Number 1, the idea that if you just want to know history, there are better places to study history than there is in our Bible. And anyone could retrieve the annals of the king of Media and Persia, and you could see these recordings there. Whether we can today or not, I don't know. But I will tell you there's a wonderful archaeological exploration of the ancient palace in Shushan. And although it's not reconstructed, the spaces are very clear. And you can see the courtyard that stands between 2 throne rooms. And you can imagine Haman standing there in the wee hours of the morning, waiting to interact with the king and to have Mordecai hung. So it's there. And we can revisit it. We can't do it today because we're not so friendly with the country of Iran. But Jewish archaeologists have been there. They've mapped it. They've pointed it out. And you can see where everything took place. But here's what's very cool. The Torah here is suggesting an arc. If you look in the book of Ezra, chapter 6, the book of Ezra comes after the events of the Megillah, and it talks about the remnant of the Jewish people returning to build the second temple. After the Jewish people were rescued and saved, the Jewish people led by Ezra and Nehemiah returned back to the land of Israel, and they begin to rebuild the temple. They run out of money, and they have no funds to build the second temple. What happens, the book of Ezra says? Darius, the son of Esther and Ahasuerus, dips into the royal treasury and in fact empties the entire treasury to provide funding for the Jewish people to rebuild the second temple. Okay, so what do we see here? What you see here in an amazing, amazing sense is the following. What you see here is that the arc is as follows. And this is the backstory and the full picture and the essence of Purim. Ahasuerus becomes a king. He's concerned about maintaining power, like all kings are. He's worried about the Jewish people going back to Israel, rebuilding the temple, and becoming a competing power in the world. After all, they had just conquered the Jewish people a few decades before. Not him, but the Babylonians who preceded him. So Ahasuerus' advisors tell him, we figured it out, the 70 years that were prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah that the temple would be rebuilt have passed. So he says, great, let's throw a party. How can we throw such a party? Well, we're going to use the kalim, we're going to use the golden cups, and we're going to use all the implements that were stolen from the Jewish temple, and we're going to use them in the party to celebrate the fact that the Jewish people are kaput, that all of their prophecies are finished, that they have no hope in the future, and that's what we're going to celebrate. And Achashverosh says, that's great. Let's have a magnificent celebration. And to add insult to injury, we're going to invite the Jewish people to come to the party, all the Jews of Shushan. And we're even, as the Megillah indicates, we're going to give them kosher food. We're going to go according to all their customs. They'll be comfortable. We want them to be part of us. But in essence, we're celebrating the fact that all the prophecies of the Jewish people are gone or lost, and that power and might and grandeur belongs to those empires who seize it, conquer others, and control it. Okay, something we're thinking about a lot right now. He throws the party. Jewish people come inappropriately. Mordechai avoids the party. In the course of the party, Vashti, by not cooperating with the king, gets killed. The king needs a new queen. Esther ends up becoming the queen. Haman devises a plot to destroy the Jewish people. On the very gallows that he designed to hang Mordechai on, he is hung himself. And on the very day he designated to annihilate the Jewish people are able to defend themselves, to suppress their enemies, and to position themselves perfectly well to return back to the land of Israel under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. Adding insult to injury, not only was the thought of Achashverosh not coming to fruition, not only was the plot of Haman foiled in a way where everything was turned topsy-turvy, but at the end of his life, Achashverosh imposes taxes on his own people. And where does that tax money end up going? That tax money ends up going to rebuild the second temple in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So you have this sense of what the essence of Purim, and the essence of Purim, therefore, comes back to just that extra word lo, that extra lamed vav in the Megillah, that extra him for him, which Haman thought was for him, Mordechai, but God knew and made happen that it was for him, for Haman to be hung on, because this is the sense of Purim. Not only are the Jewish people rescued, not only are the plots of the enemy foiled, but every design that is designed against the Jewish people literally turns on itself. And that's an amazing feat in terms of understanding the God's running of the world. I want to give you another example just as a reference point from the Torah itself, just to illustrate it a little bit more clearly. If you look in the book of Shemot in Exodus, Paro decrees that all the boys to be born will be thrown into the Nile. Why did he do that? So Jewish tradition of Talmud tells us because his astrologers said, oh, we know that at this time, a boy is going to be born who is going to lead the redemption of the Jewish people and take them out of Egypt. So therefore, what is Pharaoh's design against the Jewish people? What I'm going to do is we're going to take every newborn child and drown him, every newborn son. And that way, God can't bring a redeemer to the Jewish people. What happens in the end? We all know the story. Not only does this boy, who is to be designated as the redeemer of the Jewish people, not only does he survive, but he's raised in Pharaoh's own palace. And he's taken care of by Pharaoh's daughter. And he's a prince under the auspices of Pharaoh. Again, we don't think of it so readily this way, but Purim is the holiday that gives us the confidence to understand that the direct plots against the Jewish people, not only do we survive, but the hand of God is such that the very actions against us turn on the perpetrators themselves. You know, a line from Shakespeare I've always loved from Macbeth: he who designs bloody instructions, which being taught return to plague their inventor. That's what Macbeth says about his plot to kill Duncan. But it's the essence of what Purim is all about. Not only are we rescued, not only are we saved, but if we open our eyes and consider what's going on around us, it's actually the thrusting of mortal blows against us, the Jewish people, that cause and lead to and the destruction and the undoing of the perpetrators of evil in the world. This is the pattern of Purim. This is what we're celebrating. And I'll give you one other example. The astrological sign in Hebrew is Dagim. We call it Pisces in English. And if you look at the classical symbols of fish, you will see a fish over a fish, two fish like parallel, usually swimming in opposite directions. The alternative symbol and the Jewish symbol has always been a curved fish and another curved fish forming a circle. The concept being that the idea, it's not just that there are big fish and the little fish and big fish consume little fish, because that's the way of the world. That's the way of a Haman and an Achashverosh and all the tyrants of history, and especially all those who have come to destroy the Jewish people. That's their view of the world. Our view of the world is circular, that when someone overreaches and it seeks to eliminate good, not only are they going to fail in doing so, but their very action is going to flip around against them, boomerang, and it's going to bring destruction upon themselves. And that's the joy of Purim. That's what our eyes become open to this amazing process. And that's why the Megillah at its dramatic conclusion notes the fact, not just that Mordechai had become great and revered, but that the king Achashverosh, for his own selfish reasons, imposed heavy taxes on the people. Why? Again, believing that it would enrich him. And then you just look to the next chronological book of the Torah, of the book of Ezra, and you find out that the next king of Persia, Darius, ends up emptying the king's coffers to build the very temple that Achashverosh was convinced would never, ever take place. That's the idea of v'nahapochu. It's not just that we somehow survive, but that God literally takes the energy thrown against the Jewish people, and like fish swimming in a circle, that energy comes back, and in the words of Shakespeare, plagues the inventor and destroys the very effort to destroy the Jewish people. Now, within this arc, I want to look at something which I think is very important to look at. And for this, I'm looking at some sources that I saw through Avi Cohn. And we're going to go back to our source sheet here, if we can share the screen. Thank you. Thank you, computer, for cooperating. Okay, here's the inner
That's
workings.
page 1256.
Thank you. Esther 5:4. There were two parties thrown by Esther a day apart, and she invited the king so that she could plead for her life and the life of her people and rescind the decree that was made against the Jewish people. And remarkably, she invited Haman himself to join her. Question, as it says in the sheet here, why invite Haman? Wouldn't the queen have done better and acted more safely and securely if she simply would have sat down at a nice romantic party with the king, with herself, and do it once the first day and then come back the next day and then throw herself on the floor and plead on behalf of the Jewish people to rescind the decree? Why did Haman have to be present? They give us 4 reasons, and I want to briefly look at each of those 4 reasons because I think they offer us further insight in terms of how we, as reliant as we are on God ultimately protecting us, how we need to conduct ourselves. Reason number 1, and there are other reasons I'm not including here. She wanted Achashverosh to be jealous of Haman, because after her goal was to have Haman eliminated and then have the decree rescinded. That was her goal. So by inviting Haman, she provoked the sense of unease on the part of the king, And indeed, one of the explanations for the king not being able to sleep that night between party number one and party number two was because he was haunted by the notion that perhaps Haman was consorting with his queen, and therefore he couldn't sleep that night. Lo and behold, he asked that Chronicles be read to him. Lo and behold, he read the story about Mordecai revealing a plot and saving him. And lo and behold, when Haman came to hang Mordecai, he walked into a trap set for him. Number two, she was setting a trap for Haman, just like I said. Number three, look at number three. She didn't want the Jewish people to lessen their prayers. The Jewish people were fasting and praying in support of Esther's intercession on their behalf. Esther thought to herself, okay, once they see the party is taking place, they're going to say, oh, look how unbelievable this whole story is. Esther somehow became queen, and now she's invited the king, and she's sitting down with him. Of course, through those machinations, we, the Jewish people, will be saved. And had that transpired, number one, maybe we wouldn't have been saved because the fervor of their prayers would have been dampened. And number two, without the number, let's just stay with that idea that perhaps we would not have been saved. So therefore, Esther invited Haman in order to convince the Jewish people that we have no one ultimately to rely on but God Almighty, even though we see things transpiring in front of us that seem unbelievable, but we need to keep that focus if we're really going to seek God's protection and God's rescue and God's salvation. And I will just tell you at a personal level, having lived through the 6-Day War myself as a teenager and feeling so stirred by the miracle of it, I can't help but feeling that somehow as we celebrated the bravery of every soldier, and they certainly were brave, and somehow as we celebrated the military victory that took place, we really lost sight to an extent of the miracle that was involved of the Jewish people not only surviving an attack on every front from overwhelming power and force, but even ending up expanding Israel and defeating their enemies so soundly. So Esther understood that, and she really felt as though life is truly in God's hands. If we're going to survive this, the Jewish people have to go to the wall in terms of their prayers. And then once a miracle happens and once we're rescued, we need to put all of our attention in the fact of being thankful to God that God rescued us, and stay clear on that point. Number four, she wanted Achashverosh to think that perhaps there was a secret between her and Haman and would therefore kill them both. And that is really a different idea. And that's a bit complicated. But according to, there's a source that says that had Haman died before the decree would have been executed, that itself would have dulled the decree. And therefore, Esther was totally willing to create such a level of jealousy and perhaps a rage on the part of the king that he would kill her and Haman. And then she was willing to do that in order to save the Jewish people. There was no sense of limitation to the bravery and self-sacrifice and commitment that Esther brought to her mission. There was not a bone in her body that was seeking to somehow make its way through this safe in the palace, because she was totally connected and totally bound up to the Jewish people. So when you look at from the outside, the structure is that God does truly, truly amazing, amazing feats in order to keep us, the Jewish people, the eternal people of God, present in the world, giving us the opportunity to influence the world, to impact the world, to inspire the world, and to show everyone what it means that to be the more reliant ultimately we are on God's salvation, the more miraculous and the more decisive are God's interventions. And not only did we rely on that in a global sense, but as we plan our course of action within the confidence of knowing that God intends for the Jewish people to survive all of history, we do so magnifying our dependence on God, our relationship with God, and clinging to the understanding that our future is totally in God's hands. And with the holiday of Purim, we can say our future is totally in God's hands. Baruch Hashem. Thank God that is the case. And with that in mind, we should all have a happy Purim. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. But I hope that this will add inspiration and give us an opportunity to really celebrate Purim like we never have before.
I do have a question, Rabbi.
Sure.
I don't understand what it was that caused the king to do such a complete about face towards the Jewish people.
Okay, that is a good question. And what I would answer you is with a sentence from Proverbs that I think we see in our own times to such an amazing extent. And that is a sentence in Proverbs says that the hearts of the rulers of the world are all placed in God's hands. So we find people out of the blue helping the Jewish people when we don't expect it. We find people in power harming the Jewish people when we least expect it. And in a certain sense, I think what we need to understand here is that God's plan carries through with our cooperation or without our cooperation. God really is running the show. We have an important job to do to A, recognize that, and B, act within those parameters of living as Jewish people, so that when God does redeem the Jewish people, it's clear that he's doing so for the benefit of all humanity.
Okay, oh, thank you.
And Selwyn, did you have a question?
No, I just thought it was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And we'll go out with a minute more of Purim music.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I wish everybody a happy Purim. Everybody should
Yeah, thank
celebrate
Purim.
read the Megillah tomorrow night and Thursday morning. Thank you very much for participating and happy Purim.
Yes, Chag Purim Sameach.
Happy Purim.
Okay.